a wonderful guest today. His name is Lew Epstein. He's a psychotherapist who specializes in family and marriage counseling, who's been in practice for over 40 years, and who has published a really wonderful book called Coaching for Fatherhood. Now, I read this book many, many years ago. So if you have a husband who you just can't understand, or a boyfriend, and you're like, what is wrong with him? This book explains that it's not his fault, it's his dad's fault. But anyways, it's a great book, and I'll put a link to that book below so you can go ahead and order it for everybody. But today's topic is what I want to know is, why do people who have been diagnosed with a disease that is caused by their harmful eating habits continue to eat these foods when they know it's these particular foods that are making them sick and fat? So one is, why, getting into the mindset. And number two, which is possibly more important, is how can we help these individuals to make the necessary changes so that they stop the harmful habits and adopt healthy habits? So, Lew.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Nina. And it's been so much a part of my career and my life to deal with the resistance to change that people have. And we all have it. I don't want to make this the subject of, us and them, because it's not like that. But we both want change and we resist change. And the question you're posing is, why is change so difficult? And why also, when people seemingly have committed to change and know even the consequences of not changing, which is often harmful to health and other goals that they have, why is it so challenging? What makes it so difficult? And I could start with the reasons and list the reasons that people don't follow through, and often the things that are counter to what they say that they do. But what I'd like to start with instead is a person that I work with. And I'll say that it's not just one person. It's really what I'd say a composite of clients, several of them, who have had difficulty making changes, and what's the psychology behind that. And also, how do I work with a client who has those difficulties? And so I'm going to call this person Sarah. I'm using that name, but as I said, it's not a one client. It's a number of clients who I've worked with who have a very similar relationship to change. So Sarah is a 29-year-old. She's a type 2 diabetic, and she's on a low dose of oral medication, of insulin. She has a career in marketing. She's living independently. She's living by herself. She's self-supporting, has a steady boyfriend who they've discussed even getting married and having children together. And she even has been in therapy. She'd like to change her habits, but she seems kind of stuck with that. And that's so often what we deal with as helping professionals, whether we're trainers or acupuncturists, or as we often prescribe and say, if you're willing to do this, then you can bring about change. And so she did come to me as someone who's stuck with the idea of wanting to change, but somehow not making the changes that she seems to have committed to. So the thing that she would like to do, she said she'd like to exercise more, and she knows about eating what she would say is a healthy diet, and knows something about plant-based diets.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, she knows about low sugar, but still finds herself what she calls junking out. And junking out? Junking out.
Okay.
And junking out is she often will, let's say, while she's trying to complete certain things at work, she has certain deadlines. Her eating habits just go down as she's throughout the day while she's trying to meet these work requirements. So there's that element to it. And when she's with her boyfriend, sometimes over the weekend, she feels that she's worked so hard during the week that she kind of rationalizes, and she says, well, you know, I've worked so hard, I just want to reward myself. And the reward, unfortunately, is something unhealthy. Like she will either have an extra drink with a dinner, or eat in ways that she knows aren't healthy. And I'm not saying she's an expert in health and diet, but she knows what she's doing is off track. So the question is, how does she deal with this? And how do I, even as someone who tries to offer help to people, how do I help her with this problem? And it's, you know, how global this is, how general it is that people, you know, say they want to change, do just like Sarah. And so the first thing I usually try to assess with a client who presents with this type of issue is I do a reevaluation of, let's say, Sarah's values. What does she value in life? And people often have, I call them domains. And some people's domains include anything from community service. Some people are into religion and spirituality. Usually I go through about 10 different domains and say, what do you really value? And with Sarah, the things that she valued were, I wrote them down: her career, her relationship with her boyfriend, who's named Sam, her desire to have a child or maybe children in the future, and she's into self-improvement. She's, you know, she's been to therapy before, and she does want to improve her health and vitality.
But that was the order that you put it in?
Well, you know, you know, it's funny. I didn't rank order it. Sometimes I will rank order it with somebody, but she did mention career as very high on the list. And yeah, I think it's pretty much, that is her order: her relationship, her desire to have children or a family with Sam. And she did put self-improvement as something that she likes, though you can see in her behavior. So I think my approach to a client like this is to go over what she values and reinforce it even, and say my intervention to be something like this, Nina, it would be, oh, so you value your health. Now, it's not to put her on the spot and shame her into feeling, but I'm not doing it right. I'll just kind of reinforce it by saying, oh, I noticed that you value that. Or you're looking forward to having marriage and children. Now, the contradictions are right there in front of us, because if she wants to have marriage, if she wants to have children, then the care of her body and the idea of pregnancy, if she's diabetic, and all the things that go along with health. And if she says she's into self-improvement, so what are we dealing with here? We're dealing with the gap between her stated values and goals even, or she hasn't really put them into goals really, and her values and her behavior. And I'm sure you deal with that all the time. I deal with it. And I can't imagine a helping professional who hasn't dealt with this, as a matter of fact, the gap. Okay, so.
I call it a disconnect.
What do you call it?
I call it a disconnect.
A disconnect, yes, that's a good way of calling it. So when she's out with Sam, I start by exploring not only her values, but now I start going into her thinking. And it's very important to understand how people think, because otherwise it just feels like, I know I've often said, that feels crazy. You know, we go into the thing like, wow, that's so off. How can you say that and do that? But we can. And I think that's very important to know that. So, you know, she's like, the thing that she said when she's out with Sam, the thing that goes through her mind is one little piece of cake or one more drink can't really hurt me. That is, when exploring her thinking, what's the thought? that precedes the action that, you and I would say is self-destructive. And that's one of them. And the other one is I've worked so hard during the week. So those are thoughts. Now that's an interesting thing. So the next thing after I've explored values, which, could take sessions and need to come back to at times, I would say it's a person's relationship with their mind, which is a funny thing to say because, we think we are our mind sometimes, but we actually have a relationship with our thoughts and our minds, which, we just take for granted. It feels very automatic, but it's not. I try to lay it out in a different way. So the relationship between our minds. And it's funny because I saw a bumper sticker the other day that said, I wrote this down, don't believe everything that you think. And it was such a profound thought because it's so true. Anytime we take our thoughts literally. So if the mind says something, we believe it. Or if it produces a fear, then we tend to say, well, I have to do something about that. And the mind is a brilliant tool, if we want to use it that way, when focused on external problems in the world. It can solve many problems, brilliant things it can create technologically and otherwise, but it's not a good, organ to examine itself. It's not a good one. Now you'd think it would be because people are often trying to solve themselves or solve their minds. And I can say from all my 40 years of work, it doesn't work. The mind is not a good tool, if we want to use that word, for examining itself because it gets thrown off, it gets distorted. So the mind needs to be looked at. And that's where I would try to work with someone on developing what I would call the observer self. And the observer self is not a new idea. I mean, it's there in a lot of mindfulness meditations and Eastern philosophy, the observing self. And without the observing self, we can't really grow. We can't examine our thoughts because we're too close to them. We're too reactive to them. And as a therapist, I see it all the time. If somebody's too reactive and they're only anxious and they can't look at how they're thinking or reflect on it, then they're stuck. So someone has to have the capacity to observe their own thinking and just observe what's going on rather than getting, let's say, fused with it or confused with it or stuck in a thought. And it's so easy to go there. I'm not saying this is a unique problem. It's everybody's problem because we can all get a thought and then ride with it like a roller coaster ride. And all of a sudden we're thrown off. And it's the mind doing what it does. The mind also does something which it's very fear-based. So it will throw us off and it'll take us along a route of fear when really what we need at the moment is self-observation and really, healthy thought. So a lot of the work around changing somebody's destructive habits and behavior is examining, are they able to observe their own thinking and when it goes off throughout the day? Because it does. If someone is, again, about to, as my client said, junk out, then there has to be some other observing self that notes that. And until somebody develops the observing mind, they're not going to have much success with the other things. And that's why, just getting back to values, it's got to be connected to values also. So, okay, so getting back to the observing self. So when a thought arises, what are we working towards doing, all of us? We're working to, instead of following the thought down the dark path or wherever it takes us, we're trying to observe and say, where is that thought taking me? Is it true? Now we need to accept all feelings and urges and sensations. We don't want to put those things in a category of judging ourselves because we're all feeling things and having sensations all the time. That's fine. That part we can just accept. And thoughts, we can both accept, but we have to do it with that mindfulness part, with that part that says, where is this thought taking me? So the idea of what's called diffusing from thoughts, observing thoughts, seeing where they're taking us is so important in the process. And people begin to learn this and work on this as they connect it to what they value. The mind becomes something that they have a relationship with that's different. It's kind of like at times, like if you have a pet, if you have a dog and the dog gets very excited about something, what do you say to the dog? You kind of pet it and calm it down. And in some ways, and I'm not insulting our minds, but our minds need that too. They will get very overexcited, our minds. And we need to say, thank you for doing your job. Thank you. You're doing you're doing a great job as a mind. But the fear trip that you're taking me on, I'm going to step back from that.
Yeah, I think you really tapped into something I never thought about, is fear as it applies to food, fear as it applies to change being scary. If I change this habit, I'm not going to be able to enjoy life. I'm not going to be able to have fun. My boyfriend's not going to like me as much because I'm going to be sober.
Yes. No, that's such a true, because the fear is really about loss too, that we're going to lose something very special. But of course, what's not factored in there is, what do I really value in life? And what
they're going to gain from these changes.
Yes, and that's another key part to this. So the big part of this, I'm talking about a model called acceptance and commitment therapy, but basically the commitment part is very important. So when we have values, we're trying to connect the values to commitments, to actual behavioral commitments that people make and keep. So the work is about taking your values, turning them into commitments, and then throughout the day, the way I work with it is, and this whole way of thinking around, it's called the ACT approach. It has to do with what I call choice points. Now, choice points are very interesting, because if we're going to concretize this whole approach, we have to look at the day. We're trying to do it mindfully, of course. We have the values, maybe more in place. But then throughout the day, there are going to be challenges. There are going to be choices. Someone's going to offer you something, let's say, and say, hey, why don't you join me for lunch with this? And you know that what they're suggesting is a restaurant that just has a very high fat, or whatever the diet is. It's just not good. It's a bar and grill, and you know it's not going to be good. That's a choice point. And at that point, you can either move towards your stated value and what you've committed to, or away. And if life becomes framed that way, remember, we're not looking at it as condemning the person. We're saying positively, if you want to live a valued and vital life, because we're getting beyond even just health. Health may be a part of that. If you want to live a value and vital life, then your choice points are what build it up. The things throughout the day. And even as a therapist who studied these choice points, I'm going to take out a book of training for therapists around this. It's called Act Made Simple. And I think it's very illuminating, and it makes it very simple.
Do you have the book in front of you?
Well, I'm going to read from it. I can't really.
Can you take the book and put it so everybody can see it? The name of the book?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah.
Okay. Great. Thank you.
Sure. It's Act Made Simple. And I'll list the books at the end of this that I think a few books might be helpful. This one's a little bit more for therapists, but it's really worded in a way that a lay public could really read it also, if they're very motivated to have this, to understand this whole process. The only thing is, I would recommend that they work with a therapist who knows this also, because it's a little bit hard to take in this whole book on your own, but it is worded very easily. And I want to read one part about this thing when I'm calling the choice points. And this is in the therapist's guide. So it says, so when we're doing towards moves, remember that those are moves towards what we value. Could be a healthy move in diet, that means we're acting effectively, behaving like the sort of person we want to be, doing stuff that's likely to make life more meaningful and fulfilling. The problem is that's not all we do. There are other things we do that have the opposite effect. They take us away from the life we really want to build. So I like to call these away moves. Isn't that simple? Towards and away. When we do away moves, that means we're acting ineffectively, behaving unlike the sort of person we want to be, doing stuff that tends to make life worse in the long term. So basically, away moves are anything you will stop doing or do less of if our work here is successful. So that's and the therapist continues, and this applies to all of us. All day long, we're all doing towards and away moves. And it changes from moment to moment. And when life isn't too hard, when things are going okay, when we're getting what we want in life, it's a lot easier to choose those towards moves. But as you know, life isn't like that a lot of the time. Life is tough, and a lot of times we don't get what we want. So throughout the day, we're going to encounter all sorts of difficult situations, and difficult thoughts and feelings are going to show up. So you're not trying to make it to the person that you're trying to help. The idea, this is easy. No, we all going to have thoughts, feelings, emotions, memories, urges, impulses, and sensations. And the problem is, with our thinking, we get hooked by thoughts. So basically, the problem is the default setting for most of us is that when these difficult thoughts and feelings show up, we tend to get hooked by them. When we're talking about those thoughts that go through our minds, they kind of hook us and they reel us in and they jerk us around and they pull us all over the place. And I think we all know what that means. And so that might hook us physically. So we start acting out in various ways with our arms and our legs and our mouth. So they hook us in different ways. And so that's the trap in this toward moves and away moves, is that there are very easy ways throughout the day that our thoughts and feelings can hook us. So the part about the observing self and the values are very important parts of this, to establish that first, how strongly you're committed and devoted to doing this, and then knowing that it's not easy throughout the day. There are many things that will hook us, and to have that observing ego, that mind that looks at itself, is so important in this whole process. So basically what we want to do is we want to move toward our valued self. And it leads basically beyond even diet and health to living a vital and a valued life. So it's bigger than just changing one's eating habits, because there's a lot at stake here. It's really about yourself and how you feel about yourself. Everything is in this. Rather than that book that I just recommended, Act Made Simple, which is really for therapists, there's another book that I think will be helpful. I'm going to hold it up here. It's called The Weight Escape. Now, it is about weight and weight loss, but it's really more generally about how to use this approach, which I'm describing as the ACT approach. It's how to stop dieting and start living, which is, again, employs this whole area about change in a different way, not just the idea of follow this diet 1, 2, 3, but how do you change your life? So I'm going to read one thing from this also, and I think this also explains the whole process. This process will teach you how to engage in health promoting behaviors, even when you are feeling negative emotions, cravings, or a lack of motivation. It will show you how to use mindfulness skills to let go of useless struggles with yourself and your body, and to escape self-destructive mindsets. Most importantly, this approach will help you to clarify what it is you most care about in your life, in health and other domains, and show you how to get to it. So that's what this approach does, because if we do it too narrowly, it just becomes another diet type of things, or you try to change this. But you can see, Nina, and I know you and I both as helping professionals know it's not that simple. These different things like mindfulness and values need to be enhanced and elevated in order for someone to really change. Otherwise, we're always left in that position of what? It's crazy. We'll have that same feeling like, this is crazy. They say this and they're not doing that. But I think these are some of the elements that go into why somebody doesn't change and how they may potentially change.
Yeah, it's interesting that you use the word values, or I use the word goals.
Well, you know, that's so interesting, because I think values, I understand what you're saying. I think in order to produce goals, at least the way I'm looking at it, the valued part, I think, is bigger and comes first, because if someone can establish that they really value something, then they start constructing or putting together goals within the commitments. So I think here's the values, and then the goals are somewhere after you've really established that I really value this. This is so important to my life and who I am as a person.
I see. So it's a better word choice, basically.
Well, I think it's a bigger category is value, what you values. And then out of values, I think, come goals and commitments. But as I said, without a mind that's flexible, because the mind has to be able to pivot during the day. And if you're very rigid, and when I work with very rigid clients, it's much more challenging to do this kind of work, because they can't pivot from a thought that they've had to be willing to make it, because it's a leap of faith actually to take a new thought and say, well, I'm not going to do this in this moment. At this point in my life, I will mindfully choose to do something different. There's a lot in that. There's a lot packed into that moment.
You know, my thought is that the people who don't want to, well, they want to make changes without actually putting it into practice. And we talked about fear. One is
Yes.
They're afraid they're going to lose their friends because they won't be able to go to the same places. They're going to have to, like, the friends are going to be mad at them because they're not going to be able to do the same things. And I'm wondering if these people are more people pleasers than, like, say myself, who I don't care if people like me or not. It's like I'm more of a leader. Like, I'm going to go my own path, and if I'm the only one, everyone's going over there.
Yes.
It doesn't bother me. Yeah.
Yes. Well, you know, I even think that's fairly universal, Lena. I actually found that those two forces that you're talking about, I mean, as a therapist, I look at them very broadly. The two forces we're talking about are the force towards togetherness. When I say togetherness, I mean the group force, the family force, which says, be like me or do what I do. So I think that's one force that operates within all families and even organizations in the world. And the other force is what you're describing, is the force towards individuality and difference. And you know what I found? I mean, this is my work with clients. I think those forces never go away. I think they're always in some dynamic equilibrium to each other, where some families, individuals are leaning one way more and some the others. But I think the tension between them is a healthy one. Like we need connection towards the group, and the group the group is always going to put out a certain idea of this is what we do together. And then there's another force within us and us, which says, no, I'm an individual. I'm following a different path or a different drummer at this time, because we're not going to disconnect entirely from the group, but we're going to maintain our individuality within the group, which we're still connected to. And I think those forces, I just find them everywhere. But I know what you're saying. The healthier part for many people, as we're talking about, would be to move in the to strengthen the individual force. And
Yeah,
I think it ties back into what we're talking about, values, because if you've established a strong sense of self and you know what you value, then your mission is clearer.
and also, it sounds like it has a lot to do with confidence in yourself to know what's best for you. And
Yes.
yeah, because people who are insecure want to make other people happy while harming themselves. And this is what seems to be the pattern.
Well, yes, I mean, I think again, we all have a little bit of people pleaser, and we have individuality. But I think what you're saying, and I agree with you, is that the balance between the two of them can be off with people. Where someone has, let's say, a family role where they always were a people pleaser, and even what they eat, let's take it back to diet. Like if somebody suggests this or does that, they won't even challenge that by doing something different. So yes, if someone doesn't have as much of a developed sense of self, which includes self-esteem, then it's harder to work around that. So the development of like, what do you value? And if we can get to the idea of a more valued self and a valued life, then the work becomes easier. But I think you're right. I think some people have a very diminished sense of self. It's harder to jumpstart and get into the idea of change, because it's almost like if self were a quantity, like let's say they only have a court, but they need a leader, you know, they just don't have enough self. And it's harder to
Yeah,
work with a client like that. And
they
I
care
agree
more
with you.
about the other people and they'll put themselves second or last. And what really I think is always strange is someone will put their job at the tippy
Hmm.
top of the values, where I wouldn't. I would put my family above my job. But
Yes.
yeah,
Well,
and really
mhm.
yourself should be on top. It should be number
Well,
one.
yes, yes. And I think there are forces that play on people that make other things at different points in their life very important. Like sometimes there's an economic crisis in a family. But I do believe that families too need mission statements. They need to know what they think is important. And even though things will go off, there'll be crises in life, individual and family. Families that have stronger sense of character around that, they say, well, we strongly believe in that, and that we're not going to give up on this particular value. If it is health, if it is honesty, whatever it is, they may sustain that more during difficult periods. And I think that's another thing, is how do we sustain our goals and our commitments through all the vicissitudes, all those things in life that have the potential to throw us off. And
Yeah.
I think those are all challenges. But that's why the recommitment to values almost on a daily basis, and the idea of intention, that's a big part of the mindfulness meditation thing. A big part of it is intention. So if someone starts out the day with intention, then that can enhance the whole area of the choice points and the values that you're trying to live by.
Do you think some people make these choices as self-punishment but are unaware of it? In other words, they are hurting themselves unknowingly, but they don't know the reason.
Yeah, I think there are, that goes into the area even of unconscious forces or family roles that people have acquired over the years. There's a gender component where I actually say when I work with women, I find them in certain ways, unfortunately, more willing to give up self
Mhm.
in service to others. And I don't want to overgeneralize because, I'm not a woman, but when I work with women, I find sometimes there's a step missing, like when they serve others, and they do beautifully nurture others in many wonderful ways. But there are times when there's a missing piece there where, what are you doing for yourself? Now, I would say on the positive side, and people often do that, women will do some of that because of the culture of women has to do at times with more sacrifice to others, and men can be oblivious to that. So there's a gender piece that men could learn to be more aware, and women sometimes are hyper aware, and sometimes sacrifice elements of themselves or their health in service to others. I've noticed that as a therapist, and often have to encourage women to first look to what they value and what they need for themselves so that they can then take care of others. You know that thing on the air, when you take a flight, they often say, like, before, putting the
Oh,
oxygen mask on your child, put it on yourself, because
right.
if you're not, properly connected to oxygen, then you're not going to be of service to others. And I think
Yeah.
that's the metaphor that I think
Yeah. If you
applies to
can't
this.
take care of yourself, then how can you take care of others?
Yeah.
And
So yeah,
also, what you are doing is an example for your kids. So if your kids see you can't take care of you, how can you expect them to succeed later in life? Absolutely.
yeah, and you're not role modeling for them what it means to be a person or a self or a separate self that has needs and needs to have take care. So you're not even modeling that. And we can see that often. But I do believe, Nina, that the approach that I'm saying about values, if we can develop that a lot, it does connect to self in a certain way. Like when values, because who we are is really what we've arrived at independently. I mean, we get stuff from our families and histories, but the stuff that's really earned or learned by ourselves is what we arrive at. And that's the independent self, the stuff that says, this is what I've arrived at. This is what I believe is right for me. And so that sort of establishes more the mission, and it's harder to shake that person off of that. It's harder, they're less of a follower at that point if they've arrived at this. So I'm always working as a therapist to develop more that part of the self that has arrived at independently or independently enough. This is what I believe. This is what I believe is right for myself. And it's much harder to lose sight of that if you've arrived at that, and it is part of a mission.
So this woman, are you still working with her that you
Uh,
mentioned at the beginning?
the beginning. Well, I mean, I said it was a composite. I've worked with
Oh,
a number of women over the years, and
okay.
and it does include the gender things about what we're talking about the unfortunate willingness to give up, to not look as seriously at their own health, and then lose sight of that in the context of relationships. So I think that's the more general thing when I work with women, but not just with women, with people who have that what you call the disconnect. And again, I always try to go back again to values. If you're disconnected from something in yourself, then it's probably what you value. So I do come back to that often and try to integrate that into somebody's life. And sometimes they really do have strong values. They just haven't articulated them. You know what I mean? When I explore it, I say, oh, well, you go to your mother's house and you take, some people say, I don't have really values. I've never thought about that. And I say, but I noticed that you go over to your mother's house and you take care of her. So you must value that relationship. Oh, yeah, I do. Or I'll notice something that they do. And I'll say, but I've noticed this. And when they describe their lives, everybody values something. They just haven't always conceptualized it in a way that turns it into a value. And then, as you're talking about, a goal.
And I believe that people put their health lower on their value list. So they'll work really hard at their job. They'll work really hard in keeping those friends, and then the health is at the bottom.
Yes, and very often we're trying to create a new triage of those domains. So we might integrate and try to connect the dots, which would be, oh, I see that you value work a lot, but you've pushed yourself sort of the brink in this type of job, this pressure job. You've been out that many days a year. You've been ill that much of the year. You've put on that much weight, which you didn't want to do. It feels to me like this thing with career, which is so important. Aren't you damaging some of your career by not maintaining your health? You see, so you want that domain of health to go up because it's so connected to all the others. So that's a primary thing. Like if someone has health and wellness very low on their domain list, then I would work to connect the domain of health to the other things like relationships, like with Sarah, the client. Well, if she's planning to have children, if she wants to have a healthy pregnancy, then it doesn't add up what she's
Right.
doing now.
So I was working with this one client, and I was doing the connection for him. And so he's a real estate agent and he wants to be more successful. And I said, okay, so let's say that you and this other real estate agent is competing for the sale of this property.
Yes.
The seller both is trying to decide which listing agent she wants. You both have exactly the same quantities. Who is she going to pick? Is she going to pick you, who, you're really heavy, and, that has some negative thoughts associated with it, which is not always true. A lot of people think heavy is lazy, and that's not always true. And sometimes it's absolutely not true. She is more likely to pick the better looking thin one. Am I right? And he says, you are right. So, but he hasn't lost weight. So I made that connection for him. He agreed, but still he did not make those changes. So I know we need to do more than that. So what else can we do? Can we say? Is there particular statements? Like, how can we, not just leave it?
Yes. I see what you're saying. And I think the thing about it, yes, one part might be appearance, but you see, I think also if his health and vitality is not way up there, even the way he comes across, and there's the way we come across to others includes all of that. So yeah, appearance is important in certain business models, but I would say what's even more important is when somebody is very vital and energetic, you feel it. And that comes from kind of a psychobiological health. It's like psychological, it's biological, it's their energy level. And we all know that when we're not eating a healthy diet, our energy levels are not right. We can crash from certain diets. We'll have periods of the day when we're very low energy. And that's not just psychological, that is a psychobiological thing. It's a gut-mind relationship. And as people, we can educate people around that. And if it fits in with their value, like as you said, well, somebody wants to do better at work when they're competing with another salesperson, but there's a lot tied into that. There are a lot of strands that go into that. And I believe it ties into, again, what do they value? And are there gaps in that? Are there disconnects in that? Which we can point out in a non-judgmental way. Oh, so you wanted that, but it seems like you're not doing that. How do you reconcile that? And then we get into the mind things, which I would do as a therapist. The mind things are, so what goes through your mind when you about to do this? What do you think of that? Now, many people we talked about the observing self. Many people I work with just have what I call a constructed self. Now, constructed self is, I am a salesperson. I am 36 years old. I am whatever the various categories they're in. And they get a certain amount of esteem from that, and they feel, well, this is who I am. But without the development of the more observing self, you're on a kind of surface level, and you're not really getting to know yourself or examining those deeper thoughts and things that arise that would help you to really examine it and see which ones, even from the regular cognitive behavior model, which ones are true. The idea of just truth. Is that thought true? Even if we're accepting the thought is just what our mind produces, just to assess that a little and see, is that an accurate thought? Because some people are operating under assumptions and things about all these things that have not been challenged. There isn't the flexibility. So they're operating under old thoughts. Maybe it's thoughts from their families. Maybe they're still being their mother or their father, but they haven't examined their thinking in that way. And they certainly haven't connected it to what are my beliefs and values? Because that's to arrive at that's such an independent thing to say, what do I value? Not what did my family value? This is a
What I
much more independent course.
what I thought was very interesting that she chose the word junked out. So when
Yeah.
I hear that word, I think of a junkie, an addict. I think that she considers herself an addict, a junkie,
Hmm.
and the junk, the poison is the high fat, sugary foods, the cheeses, all the things that make us ill. And
Right.
she probably thinks of herself as an addict who cannot quit.
Yes, there may be addictive parts, and even the way she, as you said, the way she perceives herself. And even that is a value laden thing, because obviously the part that sees herself as a junkie, or the junkie part, that's not a good feeling about herself. In other words, it's not a part that comes from what we might call the healthier parts of, she aspires to be healthy. She aspires to have family. She aspires to have a healthy relationship. And there's this other part of her. And, we can view it from the lens of the idea of we all have parts too, because there's another, aside from the ACT model, which I've been presenting, many times there's a part of us we could call the inner critic, the part of us that can be hard on ourselves. It sounds like the voice of a parent or authority figure, or the inner dictator, some people have called it. And it seems fairly universal. It's not like just, he has an inner critic. We all have some of that. And it speaks to us in a language that can be shaming and self-condemning. Now, there's absolutely no value in that part to us as adults, because it doesn't bring about change. It actually impedes change, because
Right.
once we're shaming ourselves, then we're kind of stuck in the shame. There's a shame cycle. And it's interesting because it's very connected to addiction in the work that I've done with clients. The shame addiction cycle is right there. So shame addiction would be a person knows who's somewhat addictive, or they seem to be compulsive about certain eating habits, and they know they shouldn't do that. And then they of course, they're not into the choice point. So at that point, they give into the craving for whatever it is, or the urge. And then at that point, they're feeling terrible about themselves. So their esteem drops, their mood drops, and guess what happens? They continue to operate within the shame cycle, which is eating, unfortunately, what they shouldn't. And then they feel what again? Shame. So that's a very self-destructive cycle. Now, people, again, with values and with a newer sense of self and an observing self, we can help people to pull out of that shame cycle, that shame addictive cycle, because it's such a big part of it.
Yeah, and if she considers herself like a junkie because she junks out, that means she thinks that she doesn't have control. And then what I try to tell people is, you do have control. It's just hard, and you have to push through those hard times. And people can't do it long enough.
Yes. Well, as part of the regular thing about most therapies will do this cognitive behavioral along with ACT, it's also just called distress tolerance. And distress tolerance is so much a part of life. And we're going through parts of the day or week or whatever, there's going to be distress. Distress meaning, we're going through a period of anxiety, or or you have low mood at some point. And our willingness, and the word willingness is very important in this whole model too. The willingness to tolerate that, tolerate it as a physical experience, because our mind is going to again take it. Our mind could catastrophize it or do a lot of things with it. But I'm just saying on the physical level, to separate that out from whatever the mind's telling us, and to just tolerate discomfort can be ironically very comforting. That's all we need to do. When somebody is having even a panic attack or even very high anxiety, the willingness to raise your to raise your willingness dial to accept that, because we can't change it in the moment. You know, when somebody's having a high anxiety thing, you know, just the idea of trying to get rid of it or avoid it, sometimes that's just not possible. So we live through periods where we don't understand it, but let's say there's a wave of anxiety. And if that's just accepted without going on a mind, kind of a mind cycle of moving into things where we either catastrophize and say, I think this means I'm having a heart attack, or I think this means that, or it must means that. And again, we're observing the mind and we're saying, interesting where the mind's taking me. But right now, what is it? It's a physical sensation. If I might have anxiety or a certain high level, you know, it's not that different from when, if let's say I ran several, you know, 100 meters, and in that running, at the end, what am I having? Well, my heart is palpitating. I'm having, you know, my breath, I'm breathing very quick. And, you know, there's a lot of sensations going on in my body. Hey, it's not that different from other things with anxiety, but I've learned to tolerate that because my mind's telling me it's okay. So we don't have control over all the sensations, and the willingness to raise that dial up. I'm willing to accept it because we all carry a certain amount of anxiety, and I'm willing to accept that, but I'm not willing to go where my mind's going to take me into all the catastrophizing and all the other things that's going to rev it up. And I'm going back to the values thing. So I want to come back to that and say, and even within those moments of high anxiety, we're still capable of learning and doing. So our choice points are still there. Like you can be anxious and still learn something. You can be anxious and still abide by a diet, let's say, or a lifestyle, I should say, that you've said you would commit, that you've committed to. It doesn't have to stop someone because they're having what they would call a bad day. You're not feeling well. Oh, well, that's okay. You're not feeling well. Well, you still have an exercise routine that you feel is valuable. That anxiety or slightly low mood is not going to stop you from doing that. If you value it, then continue doing it. You'll try to still live a valued life. We're all going to have moments or periods of time when our bodies and minds are not operating exactly in the way we want. So I just think that's very important. This thing we talked about, distress tolerance, or the willingness, and I'm using the word willingness particularly because you have to be willing to do it. That dial has to be up to meet the discomfort. Because if some people go right into the addictive cycle or right into the idea, well, I need my comfort food now. No, you don't. You need your values. And I think that's very important because it's so easy to fall into that and feel, because I'm feeling this, that must mean that. It's called emotional reasoning, but it's not accurate.
Yeah, people will say that the most interesting things, they'll use the words, you know, I had a bad day, so I'm going to reward myself for doing this. It's like, no, you're actually punishing yourself. Yes. Because what you're doing is going to make you more miserable. Eating that food can't last more than 15 minutes at most. And then you're miserable the rest of the day. You're in pain, and then you're angry at yourself for eating those things, which really doesn't, Yes,
but I think the thing about that, Nina, is the hard part with that, as you and I both experience as people who try to help other people with it, just giving them the advice doesn't always work. No. So the thing I was talking about before about the connecting it to the value system is important, like even raising it as a question rather than a statement. Because I know, you want to just tell that person, look what you're doing, it's self-destructive. That's basically what we're saying at those times. However, maybe more effective. So let me understand that better. So when that happened in that point in the day, you felt this, you thought this, and then you did that. And just to make it a point of observation, it was rather than coming in with advice, which many people just experience it as shaming. They don't really, not going to take it necessarily unless, because you want their value and their thinking to meet that moment in a way that's different than they do it before. So the idea that they can apply and use a different type of thinking and acceptance of certain feelings, perhaps, a noticing of the thoughts and the connecting it to their value. If we do it for them, then we become, the critic. If they do it, so you want to get them to be able to connect the dots, and then they do it, and that's an internalized value. They apply it to that thing in their life, and that's where they learn and they feel better about themselves because they were able to do that. So it's really it's an internalized value that then they can apply to various situations.
Yeah, I am aware that I need to ask people questions
Yes,
instead of giving statements, and that's not what I'm used to.
I
So
understand.
that's something I do want to work on.
Sure,
And yeah, that makes
sure.
a lot of sense.
We all need to work on that. I mean, most of my work with parents is about that. It's about most of the time when I'm working with parents, I'm saying, could you reframe that as a question to your child? Could you reframe that as a question? Because, especially with teenagers, I mean, the idea that you'd want them, like if you give them another piece of advice or something like that, they can easily tune it out. But a question which is actually saying, I believe you're competent enough to do this. So the idea of what do you think? What do you think about that, rather than giving advice? It actually is making a statement to them of, I believe you're pretty smart and you're pretty competent, so I'm not going to give you the answer. What do you think? And so with our clients too, I find the questioning is more effective because it engages them without a shaming, without any criticism. What are you thinking at that time? And it allows exploration. Observing ego. If you want the observing ego to develop, then ask a question.
How do you deal with, you tell a client or you help a client and they're doing the exact opposite of what you basically told them to do without you being frustrated with them?
Yeah, no, I understand that. And there is a frustration. I mean, that's our being willing to feel our frustration. However, we don't act on it. What I would do then is go back to the piece that has to do with, for instance, many times with therapy, and the question is, they have goals of therapy. As a good therapist, hopefully I review that and go, and why are they here? And so again, without condemning or criticizing, I go back to some of their goals of therapy, of what they're working on something, and it would seem like they did something that was contrary to their goals, and the idea of let's try to understand that better. See, we're working on it together as an underlying problem, not just the behavioral problem. Let's try to understand that better. So when you got to that moment, what was going through your mind? What were you thinking? What were you doing? What were some of the forces going on there? Maybe there were, as you said, other people around. So it's a very fertile ground for exploration as a therapist. Now, I'm not saying every health professional is going to go into that area, but you will probably do better from asking the question, what was going on for you at that moment? Or what were you going through? Because it sounds like, and you're doing it you're trying to do it with compassion, because the idea, this is universal. We all have these feelings. We all sometimes at times deviate from our values. So, the idea, the compassionate part is, it must have been hard for you, or that was a difficult moment, but let's do a postmortem. Let's take a look at that and unpack it, what was going on there. And so then the person is empowered with trying to understand the moment, understand what they were going through, and how they moved away. Because we're talking about, basically, in this model that I was studying, towards and away. Can't get much simpler than that on that level. You're either moving towards what you value or away. So you might have to go back to the value without scolding. So, like the idea, I know you've made such a commitment to this, and I know how much you want that, but it seems that at this moment it was hard for you. Gee, what was going on there?
Right.
Sounds challenging at that moment. So the compassionate part is we don't want them to beat themselves up, just the idea of that to approach it with understanding and self-observation. So you're trying to develop that part of the self that can observe. And if that connects to values in that moment, that person can do what we're talking about, pivot. In other words, are willing to pivot from a rigid type of thinking to something more flexible. That's probably the goal, is that flexibility. They can actually move from something that that they think or thought was a truth. And in a moment of maybe this work and this insight and this understanding, they can pivot. And it implies flexibility when someone can pivot and change a behavior in a moment, because it is moment to moment too. Those choices we have throughout the day.
Yeah, it's not simple. There isn't a one
No.
sentence, one statement, one
No,
direct.
no, it isn't. And also because people do it in all different patterns. Like they don't do it neatly one way. Someone will deviate from a pattern that they committed to in one way, and someone will do it another way. But it will come back to some of these basics things that we were talking about values and self-observation in the present. And any ways that we can encourage that in any of the helping fields is positive.
Right.
I mean, it's so easy for us as professionals to get angry and annoyed with clients because there is that disconnect. And as you watch it play out, it can be both frustrating and a little bit mind-boggling because it doesn't fit in. Let's say you've achieved a certain level of this area of attaching your values to commitments and following through. If you watch someone who's not doing that, it is hard to watch. Let's admit that it's not easy to watch someone doing things that are self-destructive because the impact of that. And it just confuses the mind, our own minds, like what is going on here? And we have to, I think, get past that. Otherwise, we're less effective too. So,
Right. Any
yeah.
closing statements or remarks or advice?
No, I mean, I just thought it was good doing this, and whenever I do present something, it's also self-clarifying, and it helps me when I articulate some of these things. No, I think that the general principles that we talked about, I think what I would like to say is that it sounds easy always in a presentation, like when I'm presenting something, because they're concepts and there's no resistance to it here. We're both having a pleasant conversation about it. But as we know, it's more complex than that. So every one of the things that I put forth, like about values and choice points that sound so simple, in the moment and at different points in life, they take a lot of work too. They're not easy things to master. They're easy concepts, but when trying to put it into practice, it requires that underlying value and commitment to do this work. So on top of that, the best quality that you could have is already having the intention to do. And I do believe, Nina, that when people come to us, that the healthy part of them, the part that has that intention, is there. And yet we're going to see the other part too. So,
Yeah, I hope so. Yeah, I hope it's forthcoming.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
thank you so much. This was very illuminating, and
Well,
there's other topics I would like to talk to you about if you're willing. Like one of them is why do people ignore facts?
Yeah.
Specifically, this is we're talking about, health facts, diet facts. They ignore the facts that they don't like. they'd rather listen to, oh, a glass of wine a day is okay, but they ignore that glass of wine increases your risk of all forms of cancer. And then they'll go even further. And we know that, certain red meat is carcinogenic, and especially deli meat, it's been classified as a carcinogen. And then people decide to go the extreme and go on these low carb, high meat diets.
Yes.
So
yes.
that was something that I wanted to cover.
Yeah, we can look at that. I mean, the idea, as you said, where do facts fit into people's perceptions and change, and all the, I think it's a big picture thing also, because all the confusion kind of in this Tower of Babel, where there's so many different ideas and things, and how to establish which ones are really the ones to listen to. So there is that larger issue of how do we form our attitudes and thoughts about things in a society that has so many venues in which we can take in different information. And, I mean, obviously you research things, but not everyone does. And so
Right.
the way that people emotionally, and I think that's the part that I think that I've looked at more, is what is the emotional part of that might be good to look at, because there's a very big emotional part.
Another thing that really just befuddles me is why people will choose surgery over lifestyle change. I mean, that's literally life or death. But those are topics I was hoping to pursue. So
I'll be glad to do that with you. Sure.
Great. Well, this will end our presentation, and everybody who's, has any questions, please post them in the notes below. And maybe Lew or I will be able to answer those questions for you in a future YouTube presentation. And so everybody have a great day, and we look forward to seeing your progress.